The evening sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden platform as the last train of the day disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind only the acrid smell of coal smoke and the rhythmic clicking of cooling rails. The locomotive's whistle echoed one final time across the vast Texas plains before fading into the endless expanse of prairie grass and mesquite trees that stretched toward the darkening sky. Amidst the scattered cargo boxes and forgotten freight, a small figure huddled against a wooden crate, a young girl, no more than 12, her unseeing eyes reflecting the amber light of dusk. Her dress, once perhaps a cheerful blue gingham, was now torn and stained with the dust of countless miles. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face that bore the unmistakable marks of hardship and abandonment. Sarah May had been traveling for days in the suffocating darkness of a freight car, her only companions the constant rumble of wheels against steel tracks, and the occasional whistle that pierced through her silent world like a knife through fabric. The journey had been a nightmare of uncertainty, cramped spaces, and the constant fear of discovery. She had survived on scraps of bread and water that a sympathetic railroad worker had occasionally slipped through the car's partially open door. When rough hands had finally lifted her from the train and set her down on the platform with no more ceremony than unloading a sack of grain, she understood with the cruel clarity that only abandonment can bring. She had been left behind, discarded like unwanted cargo by people who had grown tired of caring for someone they saw as a burden. Her fingers traced the rough wood beneath her, feeling for any familiar texture that might offer comfort in this strange new place. The platform was foreign, cold, and unforgiving. Every splinter and groove told a story of countless travelers who had passed through this remote outpost, but none of their stories offered her any hope. The scent of creosote from the railroad ties mixed with the distant smell of cattle and prairie grass, telling her she was somewhere vast and open, a place where a blind, mute girl could easily disappear forever without anyone noticing or caring. The wind carried sounds that were both alien and somehow familiar, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of grass in the evening breeze, and somewhere far off, the lonely howl of a coyote greeting the approaching night. These sounds painted a picture in her mind of endless space, of a land so big that a person could walk for days without seeing another soul. As darkness began to settle over the Texas plains like a heavy blanket, the temperature dropped noticeably. Sarah May pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, but it provided little protection against the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. She had no idea where she was, no understanding of how she might find food or shelter, and no way to communicate her desperate situation to anyone who might happen upon her. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her growing despair, like thunder breaking the silence of a summer evening. The rhythmic thunder grew closer, accompanied by the creak of leather saddles and the soft jingle of spurs against stirrups. Sarah May pressed herself smaller against the crate, her heart pounding as she sensed a presence dismounting nearby. The footsteps that approached were measured and deliberate, belonging to someone accustomed to moving with purpose and authority. She could smell leather and horses, tobacco and something else, something that spoke of wide-open spaces and hard work under the Texas sun. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away, and she could feel eyes studying her, taking in her bedraggled appearance and obvious vulnerability. "Well, I'll be damned," a deep voice said softly, the words carrying a mixture of surprise and something that might have been compassion. "What in the hell are you doing out here all alone, little one?" The voice was rough around the edges, weathered by years of shouting orders across vast distances and speaking to men who understood only strength and determination. But underneath the roughness, Sarah May detected something else, a gentleness that seemed almost out of place in this harsh landscape. She turned her face toward the voice, her sightless eyes reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound emerged. She had learned long ago that her voice was trapped somewhere deep inside her, locked away by trauma and fear that she couldn't even fully remember. The man, for she could tell by his voice and the heavy tread of his boots that it was indeed a man, seemed to understand her silence. She heard him shift his weight, the leather of his chaps creaking softly, and then felt the warmth of his presence as he knelt down beside her. "Can't speak, can you?" he said gently. "And those eyes? You can't see either, can you, child?" Sarah May nodded slowly, her small hands clutching the edges of her shawl. She had learned to read people through their voices, their breathing, the way they moved. And this man's voice told her things that gave her the first glimmer of hope she had felt in days. There was strength there, yes, but also kindness. There was authority, but also protection. "Jesus Christ," the man muttered under his breath, and she could hear the anger in his voice, not directed at her, but at whatever circumstances had led to her being abandoned in such a place. What kind of bastards would leave a child like this out here to die? The question hung in the evening air like smoke from a campfire, and Sarah May felt tears she had been holding back for days finally begin to flow down her cheeks. Someone had finally seen her not as a burden or an inconvenience, but as a human being deserving of basic compassion. The cattle baron's decision setting, the same railway siding and the journey to Blackwood Ranch. James Blackwood had built his empire through decisive action and unwavering determination. At 45, he commanded respect across 3 counties, his word carrying the weight of law on the vast Texas plains that stretched from the Rio Grande to the Red River. Men twice his size stepped aside when he walked into a saloon, and his name was spoken with a mixture of fear and admiration in every town, from Austin to El Paso. He had ridden to the railway siding that evening expecting to collect a shipment of barbed wire that would help him expand his already massive holdings. The new wire was supposed to help him fence off another 1,000 acres of prime grazing land that he had recently purchased from a family of settlers who had given up their dreams of farming in the face of 3 consecutive years of drought. What he had not expected was to find a child abandoned like a piece of forgotten freight, left to face the approaching night and all its dangers with nothing but the clothes on her back and a thin shawl that wouldn't protect her from a summer breeze, much less a Texas winter night. The sight of the small girl, her dress torn and dusty from her journey, her face turned upward as if listening for sounds only she could hear, stirred something deep within his chest, a feeling he had buried years ago when his own daughter had been taken by the fever that swept through the region like wildfire, claiming the lives of dozens of children and leaving behind only grief and empty houses. His daughter Elizabeth had been about the same age as this abandoned child when the sickness took her. She had been the light of his life, the reason he worked from dawn to dusk building something that would last beyond his own lifetime. When she died, something inside him had died too, and he had thrown himself into his work with a single-minded determination that had made him wealthy, but had also made him hard. Now, looking at this helpless child, he felt those carefully buried emotions stirring again. Her vulnerability in the face of such abandonment reminded him of his own losses and the capacity for cruelty that seemed to follow the innocent wherever they went. But it also reminded him of something else, the capacity for good that still existed in a world that often seemed determined to crush anything soft or gentle. "Easy there, little one," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentle authority he had once used with his own child during her brief life. "Nobody's going to hurt you, not while I'm here." Sarah May's head turned toward his voice, her expression a mixture of fear and desperate hope. She had learned to be wary of strangers, especially men with deep voices and heavy footsteps, but something in this man's tone, made her want to trust him. When he extended his weathered hand, palm up, in a gesture of offering rather than taking, she hesitated only a moment before placing her small fingers in his palm. His hand was rough and calloused from years of hard work, but it was also warm and steady. She could feel the strength in it, the kind of strength that came from handling horses and cattle and men who respected only power. But she could also feel gentleness, a careful control that told her he knew how to be soft when softness was needed. "That's it," he said encouragingly. "You're safe now. I'm going to take you somewhere warm, somewhere you can get a hot meal and a clean bed. Would you like that?" Sarah May nodded eagerly, and for the first time in days, she felt something that might have been relief. This man, whoever he was, seemed to understand that she needed help, and more importantly, he seemed willing to provide it without asking for anything in return. James studied the child's face in the fading light, taking in the delicate features that spoke of good breeding despite her current bedraggled state. Her clothes, though torn and dirty, had once been well made. Her hands, though small and thin from hunger, were soft rather than calloused. This was not a child who had grown up on the streets or in the poorhouse. This was someone who had once known comfort and care, which made her current situation all the more tragic. "Can you ride?" he asked gently. "I've got my horse here, and it's a long walk back to my ranch." Sarah May nodded again, though she had never actually ridden a horse in her life. She had been around them enough to know their smell and the sound they made, but the idea of climbing onto the back of such a large animal was terrifying. Still, she trusted this man's voice, and if he said it was safe, she would try. James lifted her easily onto the front of his saddle, settling her carefully before swinging up behind her. His horse, a large bay gelding named Thunder, shifted slightly under the additional weight but remained calm. The animal had been trained to stand steady under all circumstances, a necessity when dealing with unpredictable cattle and even more unpredictable men. "Hold on to the saddle horn," James instructed, guiding her hands to the leather-wrapped protrusion at the front of the saddle. "Thunder here is as gentle as a lamb, but I want you to feel secure." The ride back to Blackwood Ranch was a journey of mutual discovery that would change both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Sarah May felt the powerful muscles of the horse beneath her, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats creating a new language of movement and direction that her body began to understand instinctively. The motion was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a rolling, rhythmic gait that seemed to carry her forward through space in a way that felt almost like flying. James found himself describing the landscape in ways he never had before, painting pictures with words for someone who would never see the beauty he was describing, but who seemed to understand it in ways that went beyond mere sight. He told her about the way the evening light painted the grass gold, turning the entire prairie into a sea of amber that stretched to the horizon. He described the distant silhouette of his ranch house against the darkening sky, its windows beginning to glow with the warm light of oil lamps. He spoke of the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, a sound that meant home and safety and the end of a long day's work. "The ranch is big," he explained as they rode through the gathering darkness. "Bigger than some towns back east. We've got near 10,000 head of cattle spread across more land than you could walk across in a week. But don't let that worry you. It's not as lonely as it sounds. We've got good people working for us, people who know how to take care of their own." Sarah May listened to every word, building a picture in her mind of this place that was to be her new home. She could smell the cattle now, that distinctive scent of large animals and hay and leather that seemed to define this part of the world. She could hear them too, their occasional lowing carrying across the night air like a conversation in a language she was just beginning to understand. As they approached the sprawling ranch with its weathered wooden buildings and endless corrals, James made a decision that would change both their lives forever. This child would not be another casualty of a harsh world's indifference. He had failed to save his own daughter from the fever, but he would not fail to save this one from whatever fate awaited abandoned children in a land where survival depended on strength and the willingness to fight for what you needed. The ranch house loomed before them, a large two-story structure built of local stone and timber that had been designed to withstand both the harsh Texas weather and the occasional Indian raid that had been more common in earlier years. Light spilled from its windows and smoke rose from its chimneys, promising warmth and comfort after the long, cold ride. "Welcome to Blackwood Ranch," James said softly as he helped Sarah May down from the horse. "Welcome home. Learning a new language setting. Blackwood Ranch, the main house, stables, and surrounding pastures." The first weeks at Blackwood Ranch were a delicate dance of adaptation and discovery that tested both Sarah May's resilience and James Blackwood's patience. The ranch was a world unto itself, a complex ecosystem of buildings, animals, and people that operated according to rhythms and rules that had been established over decades of hard-won experience. Sarah May's world expanded from the confines of touch and sound to encompass the vast sensory landscape of a working cattle ranch. Every morning brought new challenges and new discoveries as she learned to navigate an environment that had been designed for people who could see and hear and speak, but it also brought new possibilities, new ways of understanding the world that went beyond the limitations that others saw as insurmountable. Maria Santos, the ranch's cook and housekeeper, became her first teacher in this new life. Maria was a woman of indeterminate age whose weathered hand spoke of decades spent caring for others. She had come to the ranch as a young bride, following her husband who had been hired as a vaquero. When her husband died in a stampede 5 years later, James had offered her a permanent position rather than see her forced to return to Mexico with nothing. Maria had a gift for understanding what people needed, even when they couldn't express it themselves. She guided Sarah May's hands to understand the layout of rooms, the texture of different fabrics, and the rhythm of daily routines that kept the ranch functioning. Under her patient tutelage, Sarah May learned to distinguish between the smooth leather of a saddle and the rough hemp of a rope, between the soft nose of a horse and the coarse wool of a sheep. "Mira, niña," Maria would say, placing Sarah May's hands on different objects and teaching her their names in both English and Spanish. "This is how we learn, with our hands, with our hearts, with everything except our eyes." The kitchen became Sarah May's first classroom, a place where she learned to identify ingredients by smell and texture, where she discovered that flour felt different from cornmeal, and that fresh bread sounded different from day-old bread when you tapped it with your knuckles. Maria taught her to crack eggs without breaking the yolks, to knead dough until it felt just right under her hands, and to listen for the subtle changes in sound that told you when something was done cooking. But it was with the animals that Sarah May truly found her calling. From the first day she set foot in the stables, it was clear that she possessed something that went beyond normal human understanding. The horses, who could be skittish and unpredictable even with experienced handlers, seemed to sense something different about her. They would calm at her approach, lowering their heads to nuzzle her hands and standing perfectly still while she explored their faces and necks with gentle fingers. James watched from a distance as Sarah May began to navigate her new environment with increasing confidence. He had seen many things in his years on the frontier, but he had never seen anything quite like the way animals responded to this small, silent girl. It was as if she spoke a language they understood, a language that had nothing to do with words or sounds, but everything to do with intention and emotion. Tom Rodriguez, the ranch foreman, was initially skeptical about having a disabled child on the ranch. Tom was a practical man who had worked cattle for more than 20 years, and he understood that ranching was dangerous work that required split-second decisions and perfect communication between horse and rider. But even he had to admit that there was something special about the way Sarah May interacted with the animals. "I've never seen anything like it, boss," Tom told James one evening, as they watched Sarah May working with a young colt that had been giving the other hands trouble. "That horse has been fighting us for weeks, won't let anyone get close enough to put a halter on him. But look at him now." The colt, a spirited bay with a white star on his forehead, stood perfectly still as Sarah May ran her hands along his neck and shoulders. Her touch seemed to communicate something that words could not, something that spoke directly to the animal's instincts and fears. Within minutes she had slipped a halter over his head without any struggle or resistance. The breakthrough came on a particularly difficult morning, when a prize bull had broken through a fence and was terrorizing the other cattle. The bull, a massive longhorn named Diablo, was known for his aggressive temperament and had injured 2 men in previous encounters. The ranch hands were struggling to contain the massive animal, their horses dancing nervously as they tried to get close enough to rope him without getting gored by his impressive horns. Sarah May, drawn by the commotion and the obvious distress of both animals and men, approached the corral where the drama was unfolding. She could hear the bull's angry snorting, the nervous whinnying of the horses, and the shouted instructions of the cowboys as they tried to coordinate their efforts. Before anyone could stop her, she had slipped through the fence rails and was walking slowly toward the agitated bull. The sight of the small girl approaching the dangerous animal on foot sent a wave of panic through the watching men. Several of them reached for their ropes, preparing to try to pull her to safety, but James held up a hand to stop them. "Wait," he said quietly, his heart pounding as he watched the scene unfold. "Let's see what happens." The bull, snorting and pawing the ground, seemed to sense something different about this small figure approaching without fear or aggression. His massive head turned toward her, his dark eyes taking in her slow, deliberate movements. Sarah May extended her hand, palm up, in the same gesture of offering that James had used when he first found her at the railway station. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the bull stood perfectly still, as if trying to understand what this strange creature wanted from him. Then, incredibly, the massive animal lowered his head, allowing her to touch his forehead between his horns. Within moments, the bull was calm, his aggressive posture melting away as Sarah May's gentle touch seemed to communicate something that no amount of shouting or rope work could achieve. "I'll be damned," whispered Tom Rodriguez, voicing what everyone was thinking. "That little girl's got a gift." The incident with Diablo marked a turning point in Sarah May's acceptance at the ranch. The cowboys, who had initially been uncertain about having a disabled child in their midst, began to see her as an asset rather than a liability. They started bringing her their most difficult horses, their most stubborn cattle, their most challenging animals. And time after time, she proved that her unique abilities could accomplish what traditional methods could not. Word of the girl's gift began to spread beyond the boundaries of Blackwood Ranch. Neighboring ranchers would ride over with problem animals, hoping that Sarah May's touch might calm a horse that wouldn't take a saddle, or settle a bull that had become too aggressive for safe handling. James found himself turning away visitors more often than not, protective of the child who had become so much more than just another mouth to feed. But it wasn't just with animals that Sarah May excelled. As the weeks turned into months, she began to develop an almost supernatural awareness of the ranch's rhythms and needs. She could sense when a storm was approaching hours before the first clouds appeared on the horizon. She could tell when cattle were restless, or when horses were coming down with illness before any visible symptoms appeared. Maria began to rely on her to help with the cooking, trusting her sensitive nose and careful hands to judge when bread was ready to come out of the oven, or when stew needed more seasoning. The other ranch hands started asking for her opinion on everything from the weather to the health of their horses, recognizing that her heightened senses often picked up things that their eyes and ears missed. James watched all of this with a mixture of pride and amazement. The broken child he had found abandoned at a railway station was transforming into something remarkable, not despite her disabilities, but because of the unique perspective they gave her on the world. She was learning to see with her hands, to hear with her heart, and to communicate in ways that transcended the limitations of speech. But perhaps most importantly, she was learning to trust again. The fear and wariness that had marked her first days at the ranch were gradually giving way to confidence and joy. She began to smile more often, to laugh at Maria's jokes even though she couldn't respond with words of her own. She started to explore the ranch with increasing boldness, mapping its layout in her mind until she could navigate from the main house to the stables to the corrals without hesitation. James found himself looking forward to their evening conversations, even though they were entirely one-sided. He would tell her about his day, about the challenges of running a ranch, about his plans for the future, and she would listen with the kind of focused attention that made him feel truly heard in a way he hadn't experienced since his daughter's death. In return, Sarah May began to develop her own ways of communicating. She learned to use gestures and facial expressions to convey basic needs and emotions. She developed a system of touches and movements that Maria and James began to understand as clearly as if she were speaking. Most remarkably, she began to use her gift with animals as a form of communication, demonstrating things she couldn't say by showing how the horses or cattle responded to different situations. As winter approached, and the first cold winds began to blow across the Texas plains, James realized that something fundamental had changed in his life. The ranch that had once felt empty and purposeless now felt like a home again. The work that had once been merely a way to pass time until death claimed him now felt meaningful and important, and the heart that he had thought was permanently closed to love had opened again. This time to embrace a child who had taught him that family was not about blood or biology, but about choice and commitment and the willingness to see past surface differences to the person underneath. The storm in the bond setting, Blackwood Ranch during a severe Texas thunderstorm. The storm that swept across the Texas plains that autumn night was unlike any the region had seen in years. It began as a distant rumble on the western horizon, a line of dark clouds that seemed to stretch from one end of the sky to the other. The air grew heavy and oppressive as the afternoon wore on, with an electric tension that made both animals and humans restless and uneasy. James had been watching the approaching weather with growing concern. In his years on the frontier, he had learned to read the signs that nature provided, and everything about this storm spoke of violence and destruction. The wind had an edge to it that cut through clothing and chilled the bone, and the clouds had that peculiar greenish tint that often preceded the most dangerous weather. By evening, the first lightning began to flicker in the distance, followed by thunder that rolled across the landscape like the hoofbeats of 1,000 horses. The ranch hands worked frantically to secure loose equipment and bring the most valuable animals into the protection of the barns and stables. Everyone knew that a storm of this magnitude could destroy months of work in a matter of hours. For Sarah May, who lived in a world of sound and sensation, the storm was both terrifying and magnificent, a symphony of nature's raw power that she could feel in her bones. The approaching thunder made the ground vibrate beneath her feet, and the electricity in the air seemed to make her skin tingle with anticipation. She had experienced storms before, but nothing like this, nothing that seemed to fill the entire world with its presence. As the wind began to pick up, bending the prairie grass flat and sending tumbleweeds racing across the landscape like frightened animals, Sarah May found herself drawn to the covered porch that wrapped around the main house. From there, she could experience the full power of the storm without being directly exposed to its dangers. James found her there as the first heavy raindrops began to fall, her face turned toward the approaching tempest, her hands gripping the wooden railing as she experienced the full force of nature's fury through her heightened senses. The wind whipped her hair around her face, and the smell of rain and ozone filled the air with electric intensity that seemed to charge every molecule of the atmosphere. "Scared?" he asked, settling beside her on the porch swing they had built together the previous month. It had been one of many projects they had undertaken to make the ranch more accessible and comfortable for her, but it had also become a place where they spent their evenings talking about the day's events and planning for the future. Sarah May shook her head, then reached for his hand, placing it over her heart so he could feel its steady rhythm. In that gesture, James understood that she was not afraid. She was alive in a way that the storm made possible, connected to the elemental forces that shaped their world in ways that people with sight often missed. The rain began in earnest then, starting as scattered drops that struck the porch roof like bullets, then building to a steady drumbeat that grew louder and more insistent with each passing minute. Lightning split the sky with violent intensity, illuminating the landscape in stark black and white before plunging it back into darkness. Thunder followed each flash with a crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Sarah May's face was radiant as she experienced the storm's power. Her sightless eyes reflected the lightning flashes, and her body swayed slightly with each thunderclap as if she were dancing to music only she could hear. James watched her with amazement, realizing that she was experiencing something that his own limited senses could only partially comprehend. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, having to raise his voice over the increasing volume of the storm. "Terrible and beautiful at the same time." Sarah May nodded enthusiastically, then made a gesture that he had come to recognize as her way of saying more. She wanted to experience more of the storm, to feel its full power in ways that safety and common sense normally prevented. As if in response to her unspoken wish, the storm intensified dramatically. The wind reached a howling crescendo that threatened to tear the roof from the house, and the rain came down in sheets so thick that it was impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Lightning struck somewhere nearby with a crack like a rifle shot, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to go on forever. But the real test came when the storm spooked the cattle, sending them into a panic that threatened to scatter the herd across miles of open range. The animals, already nervous from the approaching weather, broke into a stampede when lightning struck a tree near their pasture. The sound of hundreds of hooves pounding across the muddy ground was audible even over the storm's fury. James leaped to his feet, knowing that a scattered herd could mean financial ruin for the ranch. Cattle lost in a storm might never be found, and those that were recovered might be injured or dead. But more immediately, a stampeding herd was dangerous to anyone who got in its path, and there were ranch hands out there trying to contain the panic. "Stay here," he told Sarah May, grabbing his hat and coat from the hooks by the door. "I have to help with the cattle." But Sarah May was already moving, slipping past him with the sure-footed grace she had developed over months of navigating the ranch in darkness. She had heard the panic in the animals' movements, felt their fear through vibrations in the ground that her sensitive feet could detect, and she knew, with the instinct that had made her so valuable to the ranch's operations, that she could help in ways that traditional cowboy methods could not. In the chaos of the night, with rain lashing down and visibility near zero, Sarah May proved her worth in ways no one could have anticipated. Moving through the darkness with sure steps that never faltered, she helped guide the panicked animals back to safety, her presence somehow communicating calm in the midst of chaos. The cattle, wild with fear and confusion, seemed to recognize something in her that transcended their panic. As she moved among them, touching their flanks with gentle hands and making the soft sounds that had become her way of communicating with animals, they began to settle. One by one, then in groups, they allowed themselves to be guided back toward the safety of the corrals and pastures closer to the ranch buildings. Tom Rodriguez, struggling to control his own frightened horse while trying to turn the stampeding cattle, saw Sarah May moving through the herd like a ghost in the storm. At first he thought he was hallucinating, that the stress and the lightning were making him see things that couldn't possibly be real, but as he watched, he saw the cattle responding to her presence, their wild flight slowing to a trot, then to a walk, then finally stopping altogether as they gathered around the small figure who seemed to radiate calm in the midst of the storm. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, fighting to control his horse as it danced nervously in the mud. "She's doing it. She's actually doing it." James, arriving on the scene moments later, saw what Tom was seeing and felt his heart stop. The sight of Sarah May standing in the middle of a herd of frightened cattle, with lightning flashing overhead and rain pouring down in torrents, should have terrified him. Instead, he felt a surge of pride and amazement that took his breath away. The girl who had been abandoned as worthless was proving herself to be more valuable than any of the experienced cowboys who worked for him. Her unique gifts, the very disabilities that others had seen as making her a burden, were allowing her to accomplish something that years of training and experience could not match. By the time the storm began to subside, most of the cattle had been safely returned to their pastures. A few stragglers were still missing, but they would be found in the morning when the sun came up and the search could continue in daylight. The important thing was that the main herd was safe, and the ranch had avoided the kind of catastrophic loss that could have taken years to recover from. As dawn broke over the Texas plains, painting the storm-washed landscape in shades of gold and pink, James and Sarah May stood together on the porch where they had watched the storm begin. The air was clean and fresh, washed by the rain and charged with the electricity that still lingered from the night's violence. Everything looked different in the morning light, cleaner, newer, somehow more alive. Sarah May was exhausted but exhilarated. She had spent the night doing work that would have challenged experienced cowboys, and she had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Her clothes were muddy and torn, her hair was tangled with bits of grass and debris, but her face glowed with the satisfaction of a job well done. James looked at her with eyes that held a mixture of pride, amazement, and something deeper, a love that had grown slowly over the months since he had found her at the railway station, but which had crystallized during the storm into something unshakable and permanent. "You did good last night," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "Better than good. You saved the ranch." Sarah May smiled and leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that spoke of trust and affection more clearly than any words could have done. In that moment, James realized that something fundamental had changed between them during the storm. They were no longer simply guardian and ward, protector and protected. They had become partners, bound by shared experience and mutual respect. The storm had tested them both and had revealed strengths that neither had known they possessed. Sarah May had discovered that her disabilities were not limitations, but different ways of experiencing and interacting with the world. James had learned that love was not something that could be lost forever, but something that could grow again in unexpected places and unexpected ways. By morning, when the storm had passed and the sun broke through the clearing clouds, something fundamental had changed between James and Sarah May. They were no longer simply guardian and ward. They had become family, bound by shared experience and mutual trust that had been forged in the crucible of the storm's fury. The ranch hands who had witnessed Sarah May's performance during the storm looked at her with new respect. She was no longer the disabled child who needed protection and special consideration. She was a valued member of the team, someone whose unique abilities made her an asset rather than a liability. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the region, adding to the growing legend of the blind, mute girl who could calm the wildest animals and work miracles that defied explanation. But for James and Sarah May, the storm had been about something more important than reputation or legend. It had been about discovering that family was not defined by blood or biology, but by the willingness to stand together in the face of adversity and to trust each other with everything that mattered. The true inheritance setting. Blackwood Ranch 1 year later, during the annual cattle drive a year, had transformed both the ranch and its inhabitants in ways that went far beyond the physical improvements James had made to accommodate Sarah May's needs. The young girl who had been abandoned at a railway siding had become an integral part of the ranch's operations, her unique abilities with animals making her invaluable during roundups, brandings, and the countless other tasks that kept a cattle ranch functioning. The annual cattle drive to market had always been the most challenging time of year, a test of skill, endurance, and teamwork that separated successful ranchers from those who failed and lost everything. It was a journey of hundreds of miles across some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America, through river crossings that could turn deadly in an instant, past Indian territories where the threat of attack was always present, and across desert stretches where water was scarce and the sun could kill a man as surely as any bullet. But with Sarah May's help, the drive had become something approaching poetry in motion. She rode alongside the experienced cowboys, her horse responding to subtle shifts in her weight and posture that she had learned through months of patient practice. Her presence kept the herd calm and focused even during the most difficult river crossings, when the cattle's natural fear of water could turn a routine operation into a deadly stampede. James watched with pride as his adopted daughter demonstrated skills that seasoned ranch hands envied. Her ability to sense the mood of the cattle, to predict which animals might bolt or cause trouble, had earned her the respect of every man on the ranch. Cowboys who had initially been skeptical about working with a disabled child now sought her advice on everything from weather patterns to the health of their horses. More importantly, her quiet strength and gentle spirit had brought a sense of peace to Blackwood Ranch that had been missing since his own family's tragedy years before. The ranch house, which had once felt like a mausoleum filled with memories of loss and regret, now rang with laughter and the sounds of daily life. Maria's cooking had improved dramatically since she had someone to help her in the kitchen, and the meals had become social occasions where the ranch hands gathered to share stories and plan for the future. The transformation was not limited to the ranch itself. James had changed too, in ways that went beyond the obvious improvements in his mood and outlook. The hard, bitter man who had found Sarah May at the railway station had been replaced by someone who remembered how to hope, how to plan for a future that extended beyond his own lifetime, how to love without fear of loss. The cattle drive that year was the largest in the ranch's history, with nearly 3,000 head of prime beef cattle making the journey to the railhead at Dodge City. It was a testament to the ranch's prosperity and to the improvements in breeding and management that James had implemented over the years. But it was also a test of the partnership that had developed between him and Sarah May, a chance to prove that their unconventional family could succeed in a world that valued only strength and traditional measures of worth. The journey began at dawn on a crisp October morning, with the cattle strung out in a line that stretched for miles across the Texas plains. The cowboys rode in their assigned positions, some at the front to guide the herd's direction, others along the sides to prevent stragglers from wandering off, and still others at the rear to push along the slower animals. It was a complex choreography that required perfect timing and communication, with each rider playing a crucial role in keeping the massive herd moving in the right direction. Sarah May rode near the front of the herd, positioned where she could monitor the lead cattle and alert the other riders to any changes in the animal's behavior. Her horse, a gentle mare named Starlight that had been specially trained for her needs, responded to her commands with an almost telepathic understanding. The two had become a team over the months of training, with the horse serving as Sarah May's eyes, while she provided the intuitive understanding of the cattle's moods and needs. The first few days of the drive passed without incident, with the cattle settling into the rhythm of travel, and the cowboys falling into the familiar routines that made such journeys possible. The weather was perfect for traveling, with clear skies and moderate temperatures that kept both animals and men comfortable. The grass was good along the route, providing adequate grazing for the herd during the rest stops that punctuated each day's journey. But it was during the river crossings that Sarah May's value became most apparent. Rivers were the most dangerous part of any cattle drive, places where a moment's hesitation or a single panicked animal could turn a routine operation into a disaster. Cattle were naturally afraid of water, and their fear could spread through a herd like wildfire, causing stampedes that could scatter animals for miles or drown dozens of valuable animals in a matter of minutes. The first major crossing came at the Brazos River, swollen by recent rains and running faster than usual. The water was muddy and turbulent, with hidden currents that could sweep away a horse and rider without warning. James studied the crossing point carefully, looking for the safest route across the treacherous water. "What do you think?" he asked Sarah May, who was sitting quietly on her horse beside him, her head tilted as she listened to the sound of the rushing water. Sarah May frowned slightly, her sensitive hearing picking up nuances in the river's voice that others missed. She pointed slightly upstream from where James had been considering crossing, then made a gesture that he had learned meant safer or better. James studied the spot she had indicated, seeing nothing obvious that made it superior to his original choice. But he had learned to trust her instincts, especially when it came to reading situations that involved animals and natural forces. He gave the signal for the herd to move toward the crossing point Sarah May had selected. The crossing went smoothly, with the cattle following the lead animals into the water without panic or resistance. The spot Sarah May had chosen proved to have a more gradual slope on both sides and a more stable bottom, making it easier for the animals to maintain their footing in the swift current. What could have been a dangerous and time-consuming operation was completed in less than 2 hours, with no injuries and no lost animals. "How did you know?" Tom Rodriguez asked Sarah May as they regrouped on the far side of the river. "What made you pick that spot?" Sarah May couldn't answer with words, but she made a series of gestures that James had learned to interpret. She had heard something in the sound of the water, some subtle difference in tone or rhythm that had told her about the river bottom and the current patterns. Her heightened senses had picked up information that their eyes had missed, information that had potentially saved lives and prevented disaster. Similar scenes played out throughout the journey as Sarah May's unique abilities proved invaluable in situation after situation. She could sense approaching weather changes hours before clouds appeared on the horizon, giving the drive time to seek shelter or adjust their route. She could identify sick or injured animals before any visible symptoms appeared, allowing for early treatment that prevented the spread of disease through the herd. Most remarkably, she seemed to have an intuitive understanding of the landscape itself, an ability to read the subtle signs that indicated good grazing, reliable water sources, and safe camping spots. Cowboys who had been making this journey for decades found themselves deferring to her judgment on matters they had always handled through experience and tradition. The evening before they reached the railhead where the cattle would be loaded for transport to market, James and Sarah May sat together by the campfire, surrounded by the sounds of the settling herd and the quiet conversations of the cowboys. The journey had been a complete success with no major incidents and minimal losses. The cattle were in excellent condition, which meant they would bring top prices at market. In the flickering light of the campfire, James began to speak about his plans for the future, plans that included ensuring Sarah May would inherit not just his land and cattle, but the knowledge and skills to manage them successfully. He had been thinking about this for months, working with lawyers in Austin to draw up papers that would make his intentions legally binding. This ranch, everything we've built together, it's going to be yours someday, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a solemn promise. Not because you're my daughter by blood, but because you've earned it. You've proven that you can handle anything this land throws at you, and you've shown that you understand what it means to be responsible for something bigger than yourself. Sarah May listened with the focused attention she brought to everything, her hands moving in the sign language they had developed together over the months. Her response, conveyed through gesture and expression, was clear. She understood that her true inheritance was not material wealth, but the love and acceptance that had transformed them both. She gestured toward the herd, then toward the cowboys gathered around other campfires, then back to James himself. Her meaning was unmistakable. Her inheritance was not just land and cattle, but the community they had built together, the family of choice that had grown up around their partnership. James nodded, understanding her perfectly. You're right, he said. It's not just about the ranch. It's about all of this, the people, the animals, the way we take care of each other. That's what really matters. As the stars emerged in the vast Texas sky, James reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had set out to rescue an abandoned child and had instead discovered that she had rescued him from loneliness, from the hardness that years of frontier life had built around his heart, and from the belief that second chances were rare gifts in an unforgiving world. The railway siding where he had found Sarah May was now just a memory, replaced by the reality of a ranch that thrived under their shared stewardship. The broken child who had been left to die had become a young woman of remarkable strength and ability, someone who had earned the respect of hardened cowboys and the admiration of everyone who knew her story. But perhaps most importantly, she had become living proof that family was not defined by blood or biology, but by the choice to love and protect those who needed it most. In the silence of the prairie night, broken only by the gentle lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through grass, they had found something more valuable than all the land in Texas. They had found each other, and in doing so, had discovered that love could triumph over any obstacle, any disability, any prejudice that the world might place in their path. The story of the mute, blind girl and the cattle baron had become a legend throughout the region, told and retold in saloons and around campfires from the Rio Grande to the Red River. But for James and Sarah May, it was simply the beginning of a life built on compassion, understanding, and the unshakable bond between two souls who had found their way home. As they prepared for sleep under the star-filled Texas sky, with the sounds of the herd settling for the night around them, both knew that they had found something that could never be taken away from them. They had found family, they had found purpose, and they had found proof that the human spirit could overcome any challenge when it was supported by love and determination. The cattle drive would end the next day, and they would return to the ranch to begin preparing for another year of challenges and opportunities. But they would face those challenges together, as they had faced everything else since that evening at the railway siding. when a desperate child and a lonely man had found in each other the missing pieces of their own hearts. In the vast expanse of the Texas plains, under a sky so big it seemed to encompass the entire world, they had built something that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of love, acceptance, and the belief that every person, regardless of their limitations or differences, had something valuable to contribute to the world. The railway siding where Sarah May had been abandoned was now just a distant memory, but its lesson remained clear. Sometimes the things we think are endings are really just beginnings in disguise, and sometimes the people we think are broken are actually the ones who can teach us how to be whole.